To welcome you all, I'm Dibyesh Anand. I'm from Department of Politics of International Relations here at University of Westminster. I happen to be the head of department right now. My main research is China, Tibet, India, Kashmir, broadly speaking, the Himalayan region from a political perspective. And my interest in general is to try to promote over the next couple of years, specifically nations or ethno-national groups that don't have states. So this is part of a series of events I plan to organize here, which is to do with Tibet, Kashmir, Baloch people in Pakistan, Kurdish, and everyone else. So for me, the interest is to see how we can try to have conversation across different parts of the world where there are people who do not feel that they're part of the current state system. Because I think it's very much important for us as academics. It is an ethical duty to not only talk of the state, but those who don't feel part of the state. So I say as part of my intellectual responsibility, but also my research interest. That's introduction to me. So I'll introduce one by one person, and I'll request the speaker to come and take the chair there. First, we have Jonathan Mirsky. Jonathan is a distinguished journalist who's a former East Asia editor of The Times and contributes regularly to various international publications, including New York Review of Books. Now, the reason I'm giving this introduction, I know all of you would have read it during the, in the email you would have received or on the website. But since it's being recorded, so I'm giving that introduction also. So we have Jonathan here, who will be the first speaker. Second, we have is Tsering Topgyal, Dr. Tsering Topgyal here. He's a lecturer in politics and international relations at University of Birmingham. He secured his PhD from London School of Economics in 2012 and has published widely in different journals on China and West, China and Tibet in terms of security and insecurity. Third, we have Shao Jiang. Dr. Shao Jiang, again, he is a colleague of ours from, in fact, my department itself. He's an independent researcher whose research interest includes relation between politics and media, comparative study of electoral systems, public sphere, civil society, democracy, and transformation of authoritarianism. He's a regular blogger also. I know him partly as a colleague and partly for being his examiner on his PhD, and that was one of the best PhDs I've ever read. It was about underground literature and resistance literature that took place in China from 1940s, 50s onwards until 1990s. Fourth, we have Dr. Martin Mills. He came all the way from Aberdeen here, so please, you have to treat him extra special. Now, the fact that others did not get clap is not because of us, but because you came all the way from there, And I mean, I have known him for some time now. He is a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Aberdeen and also the head of department now, and co-founder of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research and has authored books including Identity, Ritual and State in Tibetan Buddhism, the Foundation of Authority in Gelugpa Monasticism, and has several papers published. The hope is that apart from YouTube, we'll also, I guess this is a part of the beginning for us in this year. We'll be hoping to organize different events at different points in time. One date, you can keep it in your diary, is 28th of February. 28th of February, not only some of us here, but many other scholars who work on contemporary issues in Tibet will be here speaking on Tibet. So that's 28th of February. I'll be sending it to you, all of you. And that's it. And we have apologies from Isabel Hilton. She's a well-renowned journalist. She could not be here because I got a message saying that she's quite unwell, so let us wish her speedy recovery. But we'll hope that we'll cover whatever she also wanted to cover through here. The format is each one of us will speak for around 7 to 8 minutes. Then we'll open it to audience question answer. When you're asking question, criticizing, you can ask provocative question, that's fine. Please make sure you introduce yourself very briefly, ask a brief question, right? We'll keep it brief. In case we realize that no one is asking question, it's getting dull and boring, right? Then we can ask you to go back again and give you a long monologue speech. Otherwise, the long speech is largely meant for 5 of us here. Thank you very much for coming, and let's start with Jonathan.
Now, this room is stuffed with people who know everything about Tibet. It's also stuffed with people whom I've known for a long time. I'm very glad to see you all here. I've decided to tell you 2 things I think you don't know. That should take me about a minute, and then I'll take another 2 or 3 minutes of your time as well. Oh, great, thank you. Ooh, very splendid.
Is that bad?
Very good. Now, we all think that the reason that the United States, Germany, of course, Britain and others, bow to the Chinese because the Chinese are so powerful, and therefore we don't want to offend them, do we, about anything having to do with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But it was not always so. Even when China was weak, people were on their knees before it. I give you two examples. In 1905, William Rockhill, an American diplomat in Peking, as it was then called, who had met the 13th Dalai Lama in India a year or two before, met the 13th Dalai Lama again in Peking, where he was under a kind of semi-house arrest and really was trying to get the Manchus to be more reasonable about Tibet. And Rockhill's advice to the 13th Dalai Lama was, Tibet must maintain close, friendly relations with China, for Tibet is and must remain a part of the Manchu Empire for its own good. Okay, that was a few years before the Manchus collapsed. They were very, very weak, and already a senior American diplomat was telling the Dalai Lama, don't annoy the Chinese. In 1933, not long after he became president, and the 13th Dalai Lama had died, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, new president in America, wanted to send a letter to Tibet. He didn't really understand how people became the next Dalai Lama, but he knew that the 13th had died. So he wanted to send a letter of commiseration to Tibet about the death of the 13th Dalai Lama, and to congratulate the new 14th Dalai Lama, who of course had not yet been born, but he wanted to congratulate him anyway. The American State Department said, do not send such a letter, it will only annoy the Chinese. The Chinese state could not have been weaker in 1933 than it was, especially in relation to Tibet, but already they were on their knees. The rest of the story you all know very well. Now, it's very common for people like me to, as they say in Peking, bash China for the way it deals with its own people and the way it deals with Tibet. What I've learned from the Dalai Lama in numerous meetings with him is not to do that. So I'll just spend a little bit of time, less than 7 minutes, telling you what he said to me recently about how he thinks about the Chinese. He said recently to me, I told President Obama that the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party are missing a part of the brain, the part that contains common sense. But it can be put back in, said the Dalai Lama. I have heard from my Chinese friends that after a year or two, there will be new people in Peking who will take initiatives, so perhaps towards more freedom, more democracy. Then he went on to say that he reminded himself and me that the Chinese had kidnapped the actual Panchen Lama and had installed a new one in his place, who was supposed to be a very loyal Chinese. That was, as you all know, in 1995. And so the Chinese kidnapped the actual Panchen and installed a new one. So I asked the Dalai Lama what he thought of the new, you might say, fake Panchen. He said, of course, he said, Beijing wants this boy to be completely on their side and to denounce people like me, said the Dalai Lama. But some of his friends have told me that he remains a Tibetan deep inside and prefers to remain silent. In fact, it turns out that Beijing can't use him. So what I've learned from the Dalai Lama is to bash the Chinese less, to think about the humanity of many Chinese. We can denounce the party all we like, but they can't keep it up. And one of the things the party doesn't seem to understand is that there is enormous affection and respect for Tibet all over the world. This is sometimes referred to as the myth of Tibet. It's not a myth. People really do respect Tibet. So when the Chinese behave in their usual swinish way there, they lose more and more friends internationally. And one of these days, it will all catch up with them, and we can all go back to Tibet and be there when the Dalai Lama arrives. Thanks.
Thank Thank you so much, Dibyesh, for organizing this event and for making me part of the program. The question for today's discussion is timely and provocative, and it can be answered in slightly different ways depending on what we mean by the West, which Western countries we are talking about, and on what policy issues we are talking about. So we can come to slightly different conclusions based on whether we are talking about Western security interests, Western normative interests, or Western economic interests. Since the the premise for tonight's discussion, and the most attention has been focused on the Chinese use of economic and commercial instruments in the pursuit of their political objectives, I will focus on this particular topic. So on the issue of putting political pressure through economic and commercial interests, in the academic literature, it seems that this practice is far more widespread than we think. And also there seems to be a recognition that authoritarian regimes are more likely to put political objectives ahead of economic and commercial interests. So I think the more important and interesting question for me is, how did we get to this stage where the Chinese government is punishing Western governments for protecting the rights of Tibetans who are considered Chinese citizens? So to get an understanding of this, we need to understand Chinese strategic culture and also have a historical perspective. So in this regard, I would like to quote a letter sent by the Qing Emperor Qianlong to King George III of England in 1793. In that letter, after rejecting a number of proposals by the English king to strengthen economic relations and to establish diplomatic relations, the Qing Emperor says this to the English king: "O king, it behoves you in the future to pay even greater reverence and loyalty to me. As a result of your perpetual submission, your country will benefit in peace and prosperity." So what comes out of this is, first, an establishment of hierarchy. Secondly, expectation of repeated and perpetual submission and appeasement. And the enjoyment of economic opportunities is conditional upon observing that hierarchy and observing that repeated appeasement. And this Chinese strategic culture, centuries-old strategic culture, closely corresponds to the European tradition of realpolitik. Now, what these two traditions of foreign policy require is that if the other party gives space and concessions, it is prudent for you to keep asking for more concession until the other party stands its ground and starts biting back. And that's when you consider other alternatives, other options. So in that sense, China is doing what it has been doing for centuries and what any authoritarian government would do in its situation. So China is in the process of establishing a hierarchy in the context of its own rise and in the context of perceived European and Western decline. And what has been the European response? I think that is a far more important question for me. And I've come to the conclusion that although we can talk about an American response, a European response, or responses of particular European countries, overall, it seems that the West has been willingly cooperating in its own subordination. And this you can see in the relationship between Western states and the Chinese government, particularly on the issue of Chinese political pressure through economic and commercial means. Western governments, working from the neoliberal principle of letting markets decide economic and commercial decisions, have worked to de-link political and economic and commercial ties and relationships. So we have, in 1993, Bill Clinton cutting off the link between human rights and democracy conditionalities to China's enjoyment of most favored nation status. And more recently, his wife, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, stated that the American administration would not let human rights and normative agenda to be an obstacle to strategic and economic interests. So if we consider the response of the Western civil society to the Chinese state, we know that the Chinese state has a very sophisticated and draconian internal surveillance system, especially in Tibet, Xinjiang, and other Chinese areas, and also has a sophisticated cyber espionage program. But where is the WikiLeaks when it comes to China? And if you look at the response of the European academia to the Chinese state, especially in the context of Confucius Institutes, the Western academia prides itself in academic freedom. But when it comes to establishing Confucius Institutes, many European universities seem to fall over each other to establish Confucius Institutes, sacrificing academic freedom. But self-censorship, whether in the media, academia, and in general life, seems to be a widespread practice when it comes to China. So my conclusion is that when China is busy establishing a hierarchy, Western states are willingly cooperating in their subordination. I would like to make two final points, very briefly. One, I would like to debunk the myth that the Western states have been very active in promoting democracy and human rights. If you look at American anti-colonialism, or if you look at post-Cold War Western promotion of democracy, you see that human rights and normative agenda has never been at the top of the agenda. It has always been sacrificed when strategic and economic interests are involved. Specifically on the Tibet issue, there is a perception that the West has been a great champion of Tibetan cause. But although we have to make a distinction between Western governments, civil society, and public, in a formal sense, throughout the life of the Tibet cause, Tibet issue, the Western governments have been more pro-China than pro-Tibetan. So from all these perspectives, what the Western governments buckling down in front of Chinese pressure is not that surprising. So I will end there. Thank you.
So thank you, Dibyesh, for organizing events and for inviting me to speak. I want to share with you 4 observations and questions. So first, it seems that the Tibetan issue has been turned into the issue of Dalai Lama. This has certainly been the position of the Chinese government. In the recent UN Universal Periodic Review on China, they blame the Dalai Lama for organized self-immolation inside Tibet. The Western government only called for Chinese government to resume dialogue with Dalai Lama. The nearly elected Tibetan government in exile lacks recognition as well as self-identification. They have not really proposed their own political agenda that might expand the space which has been created, but also limited by the Dalai Lama's middle way approach. Secondly, Tibetan is a bargaining chip for the West when dealing with China. It is a general assume the country that welcome the Dalai Lama visit will pay the price of losing China's market. Because of this assumption. Top leaders in South Africa, Taiwan, Japan, all declined to meet with the Dalai Lama in recent years. David Cameron met with the Dalai Lama in 2012 and now promised not to meet with the Dalai Lama again. The implication is that the meeting with the Dalai Lama, the UK had been punished by economy. But in fact, the trade between China and the UK in goods trade reached 63 billion in 2012, surging 7.5% compared with 2011. Also, you can look at this figure. Quite similar. When Obama meet the Dalai Lama, also the trade between America and China still faster growth between the service, on service and goods. You can look a lot of the other countries, French and other countries. So I just collect the data. So what does it mean? Actually, China needs the world market more than the world needs China. China's own financial and economic crisis is much more serious than that of the West. Thirdly, China's colonization of the Tibetan is being strengthened by global capital chains. The West has joined in the blending of the resources in Tibet. There are many such examples. For example, the Siemens and the China National Gold Group joined mining at the Jiang in Tibetan area, which provide key material of military equipment for factories in Sichuan and in Mongolia. In addition, with technical assistance by food motor company, the military equipment are used to facilitate crackdown on Tibetan uprising. So you can look at the actual is a karma mining, and also they get the raw material and just made this they call the anti-terrorist vehicle. You can look at this. The main material comes from the Tibetan area. So, fourth, I want to mention some of new device of the CCP has developed in order to control Tibet. The CCP third plenum developed at least 2 main surveillance and crackdown in Tibetan area. Last week, the CCP third plenum announced the establishment of National Security Council, which will incorporate domestic and foreign military decisions to serve the stability maintenance. They will allow the CCP to crack down very effectively and quickly on resistance in Tibetan area. In addition, Chinese government has developed linguistic surveillance technology to monitor voice calls, message sent online, as well as image within the communication online in areas such as Xinjiang and Tibet, where officials do not understand the local language. Finally, I want to put forward a question. Apart from the West, Dalai Lama, and the Chinese government, are there any other actors in the Tibetan issue, especially non-state actors, civil societies? What impact will they have on Tibetan future? Thank you.
Hello, my name's Martin Mills, and I'm going to presume you can hear me at the back by now. I was invited here largely because I set up and helped set up the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research, which is an academic establishment which largely covers, in my case, a whole range of religious and ritual studies. And some of you in this audience I know already have probably heard extremely arcane papers from me on the subject possibly of Songtsen Gampo. Today, however, I want to talk from an entirely different perspective and keep it much, much simpler than that. I know I probably was expected to talk about His Holiness, and I could have done that. It would be easy to talk about His Holiness's contribution. If we're talking about the Dalai Lama being bad for the West, we know what we're talking about. We're talking about His Holiness being a Nobel Prize winner. We're talking about his work on the notion of interdependence, of compassion, of non-violence. We're talking about his policies of non-sectarianism, all of which he has said for almost now on 60 years. He's never really changed that view. We're also talking about the question of, for example, this country. We're talking about the fact that the last time His Holiness came to Britain, when he came up to Scotland, right near Aberdeen, he didn't actually visit Aberdeen, which is a terrible shame. When he came up here, pressure was clearly brought to bear at several levels of government not to meet His Holiness. Whether or not we're talking about, for example, something as relatively kind of complicated as a Leeds City Council, for example, hosting him, or something as absolutely simple as 2 MPs, Tim McNaughton and Norman Baker, simply being not allowed to have a simple lunch with him. This is what we're talking about. And let's talk about the other side of the argument. The argument here is put very, very simply. It's about money. Okay? We're talking about British exports here. Okay? And fine, it's important that we mention some numbers as far as that's concerned. When people say British exports, we are talking about a lot of money. We're talking about £7 billion worth of British exports every year, a number which is expanding at 20% per annum. Okay? So that's a serious argument, and that's the kind of thing that British politicians will listen to. In this sense, it's important to note that this is a question which is not, however, about His Holiness. In a certain sense, it's not about Tibet. You will hear from my accent, and I hasten to add in this regard, I'm largely probably different from most people in this room. I'm a British citizen, and I'm going to speak in that regard. This is a question about China and a question about us. If we're talking about the West, fine, I'm a Westerner. I'm happy enough with that. It's a question about how we feel about ourselves and what we think our moral and political culture should be like. Now, as far as that's concerned, we need to understand that obviously governments are governments and ordinary people are ordinary people. Governments act according to convenience, not according to conscience and not according to conviction. But that is not the same as us. It's not the same as the 120 people in this room. In that sense, what a government does and what we do, what universities do, what councils do, what all of us as individuals do, is different from that thing. And we need to ask ourselves the question, is it true what has been put to us? If we are changing our political culture such that somebody who has never incited a riot that I've ever spotted, has never led a rabble, has never, basically speaking, stood up in public and said, yes, people should kill Chinese people. Tibetans should kill Chinese. This has never been said. That somebody who has never ever done anything like that should not have the freedom to come here and speak, that is a very, very serious issue. And it's an issue about Britain's civil and political culture. I'm going to talk about Britain for the moment. America is another issue. Belgium, Sweden, all of these other places, they can deal with themselves. I speak as a British citizen. And the question we have to ask, there are two questions here, the first is China worth that? Is China worth that enormous change, not simply in terms of what we do in administrative terms or who we give a visa to, but in a sense, in our hearts, in our political consciences? Now, as far as this is concerned, I'm going to go back to the numbers that we began with. And my argument would be, largely speaking, no, it's not worth that. But it's important to address that lovely numbers question, because people haul it out quite a bit. We, Britain, export £8 billion worth of British trade to China. That is expanding at 20% per annum, which is a prodigious rate of expansion. But, and here's the big but, that is half what we export to the Republic of Ireland. It is half what we export to Belgium. Even under those numbers, even with a 20% expansion rate, it will be 5 years before our exports to China even catch up with our exports to Belgium. It will be 15 years before our exports to China, even if it keeps at that rate, and that's a question, even if it keeps at that rate, it will be 15 years before our exports to China match those to Germany today. Exports to which, I hasten to add, are also increasing at 20% per annum. This is not to match with, for example, America. There's no sign, actually, that it's going to catch up at all. As I say, 7 billion per annum to China, 31 billion per annum to the States, 27 billion per annum to Germany. And yet, strangely, we make this fundamental distinction. We sit there, Tsering Topgyal has commented in great depth, and somehow we connive in our own submission to this question. And we don't know why. Now, in that sense, there is one important thing. I haven't mentioned it, by the way, but it is important to know about it. What China does have, it may not be all of that export. I know it has 1.4 billion people who somehow are all going to become middle class without at the same time basically destroying the world economy, who somehow are going to become this thing. There's this great potential market there, which shows really very little sign of realizing itself. But what they do have, and that is important, by the way, in case anyone asks you, is an awful lot of cash. They have an enormous amount of financial liquidity. And in the last few years, particularly since 2007 and 2008 with the credit crisis, that has been a very, very important economic issue. We needed cash. We didn't need it for very long. We needed it for 5 or 6 years. We needed it to get past that bump. That bump we made for ourselves. So, when somebody says, we shouldn't give in to economic issues, it's important to know what those are and how they actually compare with one another. But the real question is this one, because we've heard about a lot of people hear about the myth of Shangri-La and the myth of Tibet. There is something of a myth of China that is going on here. And that is, in particular, the myth of the great upcoming Chinese economic century. Now, it's a myth because it hasn't happened yet. There's a great assumption that it will. And certainly, if you see the vast expansions of Chinese cities, the enormous expansions of factory power, the fact that basically speaking, almost everyone in this room who has a laptop made in China, that most of us who have cars will have cars made in China, that thing which has expanded over 20 years, the assumption is that will continue. That will continue. Now, perhaps it will. But the question is, do we bet our entire political consciences on whether or not it will? The truth of the matter is, China is clearly under enormous internal strains. Enormous internal strains. And those strains show at every level. Whether we sit there and say that between 2006 and 2010, even the number of what are referred to in Chinese bureaucratic terms as mass protest events have doubled over 4 years. We're talking about tens of thousands of people under any of those mass protest events. But there's a sort of darker side here. One of the previous speakers mentioned the question of self-immolations. Now, this is something that, as part of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research, and as part of my work for the Scottish Parliament, I did some research on. 125, depending on how you count them, Tibetans have self-immolated since 2009. We might ask the more basic question of whether or not we're prepared to listen to that or not. But let's point out something a little larger. A lot of people sort of say, well, is this some strange religious Taliban thing? And most of you will know that it's probably not. The truth of the matter is that public suicide of this kind is not a Tibetan tradition. It is a Chinese tradition. It's a very long established one. Not only that, but the self-immolations that we see in Tibet today are a tip of the iceberg of the broader panoply of public suicide in China, which is overwhelmingly linked to economic expansion. Overwhelmingly linked to economic expansion. To the extent to which, as I say, if you have, like me, a laptop made in Shanghai, probably by Foxconn, you may not know of the 150 Foxconn employees that in November 2011 stood on the top of the Foxconn building, which was 30 floors high, and threatened to throw themselves off. 18 of them had already committed suicide at that point. You may have seen, as we all have, the massive, wonderful rebuilding and expansion of Chinese cities. But ask yourself this question: what happened to the people that lived there? Land grabs by private companies in China are expanding 12-fold since 2006. Obviously, they went through a bit of a bump in 2008, but they didn't go back down again. They continued to expand. In 2006, there were 131,000 land grabs. That is people being forced off their lands, forced out of their houses to make way for a public bus station, a new building, a new road, something on those lines. The tenancy issues regarding these are one of the central constitutional issues in modern China. They are also a source of a huge number of self-immolations, which generally speaking don't get covered. I know that Tibetans complain that the modern press, the Western press, don't cover the self-immolations very much, but they cover them, the Tibetan self-immolations, a huge amount in comparison to ones in China. You may recently, for example, have noted the car that crashed and exploded in Tiananmen Square. This is actually part of a hugely long history of people taking their grievances at having their houses taken away, having their land taken off them by mining companies. All of this that they take to Tiananmen Square to protest, usually fatally. They're not shot. They commit suicide publicly to shame the government. To the extent to which the Beijing municipal authorities in 2003 passed a bylaw stating that it was illegal to commit suicide in Tiananmen Square anymore. If you go there now, the soldiers there carry fire extinguishers, not AK-47s, just like they do in Naba in Tibet. In this sense, we have a question about China, which is not simply a sort of old Cold War question, which says, ooh, nasty dictatorship, nasty communist dictatorship. No, what we have here is a combination of powerful capitalist economics and a powerful state. But that state is increasingly expensive to maintain control of the very powerful horse that it is riding, and no one knows where. We know, for example, not only were these massive expanse of mass protest events, huge quantities of public suicides, but for the last 3 years, the People's Republic of China has spent more money on internal security than on its entire military, army, air force, navy, and nuclear combined. At the moment, that stands at $111 billion a year on internal security, and that number is going up. Now, under all of those circumstances, we have a question to ask. And this is not a question that sets Tibetans against Chinese. This is a larger question about the People's Republic of China as a whole. And we have a question that says, is this a future that we in the West are prepared to bank our political and moral consciences on? And as far as that's concerned, to my mind, the answer is, well, not really. But it is clearly what we've done. 10 years ago, we were told in this country that constructive economic engagement with China would change its political system for the better. The fact that we are even having this discussion, the fact that we're even asking the question that we're asking, shows that quite the opposite has happened. Thank you.
Leave it, actually,
Leave it
it's
at
better.
one.
It is good to give it makes a lot of sense, so leave it, Thanks to all 4 speakers, because they have covered most of what I thought I would cover. So I can stop and not speak anything, or I could speak out my mind. So let me start out with a basic fact. A basic fact is that we are talking of a colonial setup. For various reasons, since 1950s, most of the time, when we talk of China and Tibet, we do not talk of colonization. And sadly, even most Tibetans, including in exile, have tended to avoid colonialism to describe the situation they are in. But when you look at what does colonialism mean? What does imperialism mean? What it means is what China is practicing in Tibet today, what China practices in Xinjiang today. But China is not unique in that, because of course, as if you look beyond China, you'll see this is what India practices in Kashmir, what Pakistan practices in Balochistan, and similar situations in the rest of the Asian continent. The reason I wanted to mention this is to remind ourselves that it's not simply about China and Tibet. It is about wider processes of colonization taking place in so-called post-colonial states. Now, what do we expect from the West? In one sense, it's easy for us to argue, look, Britain is a democracy, West is about democracy, about human rights. Come on, how can they be so ignorant and how can they be so short-sighted that they are sacrificing human rights and commitment to human rights for short-term economic gain? But I'd agree with Tsering here in terms of, and going back to looking at, but what has Western interest vis-a-vis Tibet always been? As Jonathan pointed out in the very beginning, even when China was very weak, hardly existent as a state, it was the West that made sure China remained as a state. And it was West from the very beginning, and there was a clash in terms of arguments between the Americans and the British. The British were seen as those who had more sympathy for some kind of aspiration for Tibetan independence. I'm talking of a period when there was absolutely no de facto control of China over Tibet, 1911 to 1949. But even the British had to sort of conform to or try to assure and assuage the anxieties of the Americans that British are not going to create a separate state in Tibet. But to be honest, if you look, and this is what I've done in the past in my research, is if you look into British interest in Tibet, they have also not been interested in independence or promoting independence. In fact, it was West that made sure that it gave the language of sovereignty to China over Tibet. It was West that made sure that it made China insecure about Tibet through 1903-1904 invasion. So West, as I've looked at in my past research, has been complicit with, rather than a neutral observer, or a critic of China when it comes to colonization over Tibet. That's what we have to keep in mind. Still, for political purpose, it makes sense for us, including myself, to remind again and again that, look, West is not simply about economic interest, but should be about human rights commitment. So I'll make that argument. I'll make that argument because in the end, the West is as complicated as any part of the world. In the West, we have the state, the government, and the people. As Martin was talking about that distinction between the people and the state. The Chinese in 1990s used to think that if there's any protest around Tibet, it must be funded by the government, supported by the government. So if you had free Tibet, they'll think, oh, it must be the British government promoting it. Now they're not totally wrong, because of course, parts of British government has often encouraged, and parts of Western governments have encouraged Tibetans to protest or even create problems for China. Specifically, let's say in 1950s or even early 1960s. We know of that. For instance, the CIA support for Tibetan guerrillas. So we should not pretend that somehow West has not tried to use the Tibet issue in order to challenge China when it suited its interest. But Tibetans, many of them, might want West to use them even more than they are used. But the fact of the matter is, the West has used them cynically and disposed them off whenever they had to. That includes in 1959 and 60 when Dalai Lama came into exile, and he was discouraged by all states, specifically India. Now, we are talking West here, not India. But the main actor in 1959 and 60 when it came to Tibet matter was not USA, but was India. And the Indian Prime Minister then tried to again assure Dalai Lama that it's not a good idea to go through United Nations. India, along with Britain, and both of them were very good in partnership. It was a good kind of post-colonial relationship where both acted in similar fashion. India and UK both, and then reluctantly US, and talked of largely cultural and religious rights of Tibetans, not political rights. No one talked of political rights of Tibetan. No one used the language of self-determination for Tibetans. And that's largely a product of India and Western states. They did it for their own purpose, because they wanted to use Tibet issue when it suited them, but then drop it because it was too big of a liability. Now, what we see today is a situation that's different. Tibet issue, and this is why the topic of the discussion, Tibet issue or Tibetans are seen as a liability by many in the West. And now, of course, we can say it's largely the state and the government, but not really. Most Western people would not know about Tibet. And it is, let's hope, events like this, we could try to mobilize more opinion to remind them why we should talk of Tibet. We should talk of Tibet not because we are anti-China. I'm not anti-China. I'm not xenophobic. At various points, whatever the Chinese government thinks, they think I'm anti-China, but I think I'm very xenophilic. I like China in various ways. But still, I question China for the same reason I question India on Kashmir. Because for me, support for colonized people today is as important and vital a struggle as support for colonized people 50 years ago. Colonialism is not over. For me, that is the reason why I would support or argue that we need to keep supporting Tibetans. Will the Western states support them? Not really, because as we see, they're largely about symbolism. To be honest, even not economic growth. As other speakers have pointed out, that economic growth perspective is quite flawed. Because if you look at very closely, what impact does Dalai Lama, of course, I was being a bit provocative by saying, is Dalai Lama bad for the West? The point is Tibet issue bad for the West kind of thing, right? Now, even when Dalai Lama visits here and everything, China almost never even claims to punish United States of America. It tries to punish UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark. Why? If China was really concerned about punishing Western states that host the Dalai Lama, they should and might punish US again and again and again. They will not, because they know that US is a powerful state. Chinese state, like any other state, including specifically authoritarian state, smells weakness. And the weakness here we are talking of is largely of European states. China has pursued what I've called in a report which is not public, but I can share it with you if you write an email to me. A report I wrote practices what is divide and neutralize policy vis-a-vis European Union states. Divide and neutralize policy where we'll say, okay, France is meeting the Dalai Lama, so we'll send trade delegations to UK and Germany. And British and Germans will be so happy that they're coming to UK or Germany. And then, of course, the Sarkozy or the French president would say, no, this time Tibet is part of China and we have no interest in supporting Tibetan independence. Then the Chinese delegation goes to France. Imagine and I'm not very good with figures, so I make these things up. So imagine that the Chinese government delegation says we'll sign 20 billion euros worth of trade deals. Very good. Specifically in case of economic crisis. The research we have to do, and no one has done research so far as I know, is how much does the actual promise and MOU signed during trade delegation translate into actual investment in France? In my sort of limited research, I can see almost zero or very little. Because, as Shao Jiang pointed out, Chinese need the world and world economy as much as the world economy needs China. To be honest, sadly, world economy needs simply a country that can exploit its labor very badly and pay low wage so that we can get MacBook for relatively less price than it would if we were producing here. The world economy, especially the Western or no state, actually cares for that. So China is important because it is producing manufacturing at lower cost. China needs world economy more or world more because, of course, remember, bad economic status could, what would it mean? It would imply Labour Party would go, Conservative Party would come back, not Communist Party. Conservative Party would come back, right? Something similar. Now, in case of China, it does not challenge the British state, but a change of party or change of government in China would imply the change of the entire state and the collapse of the entire structure. And this is why, for Chinese government, economic development of certain kind is very important because that is the only story they can sell to their own people. They are no longer communist. They have given up on communism many, many years ago. They are largely hyper-capitalist, but they're also very communist state in terms of political authoritarianism. So the only story of success they can sell is, again and again, is simply of continuous economic growth. For that economic growth, they need Europe more than Europe needs China. And they need Europe, but the reason why European states have been quite bad at responding to it properly is because they remain disunited and they do not act as together. For instance, if Norway is being punished states get punished for hosting the Dalai Lama. What if all states in Europe say, okay, we are going to host the Dalai Lama and meet him? What do you think the Chinese will do? Will the Chinese stop trading with or reduce business relations with all European countries? No, they won't. They won't because they know it's in their interest to continue to trade. The only reason they can get away with this is because Europeans remain disunited. And they remain disunited because they remain quite parochial in how they approach China. And it goes back to, again, this myth of China, right? I mean, even someone like me has critiqued the myth of Tibet often. But in fact, we should be looking at how myth of China is so powerful. It has been here for 300 years almost. And how we need to challenge it. Because myth of China can suit Western interests, but myth of China of a certain kind does not even suit majority of Chinese people themselves. Because majority of the Chinese people, yes, they may think they are getting all these economic benefits because Communist Party is in power. But there are other big non-Western states that are not communist, not authoritarian, but doing economically as good, as bad as China is doing. And therefore, we need to remind ourselves again and again that we're talking of complicated situation. And I'll conclude in one minute is that, is Dalai Lama bad for Western business? Not at all. I don't think so. He may be bad for, Tibet issue may be bad for a couple of people here and there, otherwise no. Is he bad for Western economy? Not at all. Is he bad for the West? Of course not. So whoever frames that question, including myself, must be out of their mind or being deliberately very provocative when we said, is Dalai Lama bad for West? He's not bad for West. He's not bad for anyone. In fact, he may be not that good for West, but the fact is he's the best person and best asset that not the Tibetans have. Because Tibetans at least are stuck with him. Because they're stuck with him because many Tibetans may want independence. But Dalai Lama keeps saying he wants middle way. So how do you deal with a fact that the leader of your nation says he's not the leader of the nation first. He's first and foremost a universal religious figure interested in interfaith dialogue. Tibetans face a unique challenge which all of us have to appreciate, which is they have a national leader who's deeply anti-nationalist and cosmopolitan. But the biggest beneficiary for and the biggest asset Dalai Lama can be is for China. Now, how do we convince China? We don't know. But clearly we cannot convince China by becoming like George Osborne or David Cameron or anyone else for that matter, Western leaders who keeps going and saying, oh, our job here is to convince our own people how great Chinese civilization is. Chinese civilization is great. Chinese civilization can be greater. It will be greater if we question it, challenge it, and try to change it rather than kowtow to it. Thank you very much. Now, before we have for audience, I have a question for all the speakers in the panel because after Lally, I'm also the chair. For me, if George Osborne or David Cameron approach you and say, look, our economy is in bad shape. We need good investment. Chinese have money to invest. And if we hold the Dalai Lama but try to speak about Tibetan human rights, it creates problems. Does it not make sense to therefore not talk to Dalai Lama, give up on him, and deal with China in a purely business perspective or economic reasons? How do you respond, Martin? Yeah, is the live webcast working actually? Oh, good. It's working.
No, it's not working.
Oh, it's not working. The one I'm shaking with.
Well, okay, that's the central question, really, in the end of the day, isn't it? I think the point here is how irrelevant we want to be. 60 years ago, the Tibetan government came to Britain and to the United States and to America and asked for its aid in supporting its status as a nation state. And in this case, Britain let it go. 30 years ago, protesters in Lhasa petitioned the United Nations. Once they'd seen His Holiness in Congress, they sent letters asking them to look into human rights in Tibet. And generally speaking, they got let down again. Over the last 3 years, we've seen 127 self-immolators burn themselves to death in Tibet. Many of them have left testaments behind. The difference is this. With the exception of one, none of them mentioned Western powers or the United Nations anymore. They'd grown tired. They'd grown basically cynical. They'd grown tired of British politicians and American politicians and European politicians, and in fact, most of us in general, saying a lot of things and then doing absolutely nothing. And as has been said, China smells weakness. It's very good at that. So the question is, this is what I would say to David Cameron, how weak do you want to be?
Jonathan, what about you? How would you advise David Cameron if you wanted to be in the same room with him?
What I would say to Mr. Cameron is that China is a very frightened state. I mean, look at how they treat the first person ever to get a Nobel Peace Prize, Liu Xiaobo. A more mild and harmless person never existed. I used to see him in Tiananmen Square trying to get people to shout for democracy. And many of the students in Tiananmen didn't really want to have democracy in China or didn't say that they wanted to have it. So it's very frightened. It cracks down on people who say the word Tiananmen on the internet. It frightens the Japanese state because the Japanese state is a bit worried about the Chinese sailing through certain bodies of water that the Japanese have always regarded as part of their control. They're very frightened. They crack down with great violence on people. But in the end, as you've heard today, they really need the West more than the other way around. And if you stand up to them, it's like any other bully. Really not much happens. It was pathetic to hear Boris Johnson, one of the greatest clowns of our time, when he was asked by the BBC in China, did you say the word freedom to the Chinese? And the mayor of London said, no, that's for the Foreign Office. I didn't mention it. And what was the reward for these two clowns when they were in China? They saw no senior Chinese leaders. So they were dissed anyway because Cameron saw the Dalai Lama for 32 minutes, or whatever it was, in the crypt of St. Paul's. We're dealing with a very frightened, violent state in China, and should be treated like any other bully.
Tsering, I mean, I know we are dealing with frightened state, right? But as you have noted, Chinese behavior towards the Dalai Lama and Tibet has been rather consistent for last many years, even when China's economy was weak. So do you think China's economic rise or non-rise has any impact upon how China behaves in Tibet?
I think when it comes to China's approach to Tibet, there is both a transformation as well as a continuity. In terms of putting pressure on foreign governments and denying political space, international political space for the Tibetans, that is that has been continuing since the Tibet issue has come up for China. But I think it's the assertiveness and degree of pressure that the Chinese government is putting on foreign governments and the resources that are available at the Chinese disposal to deny political space for the Tibetans. That is a new development. And it has to do with China's economic rise. So there is both a continuity as well as a change. But to go back to the question about George Osborne, if I may, very briefly, I would sympathize with this situation to some extent because we don't seem to be aware of actually an academic paper written by two German economists on the Dalai Lama effect, the so-called Dalai Lama effect on trade between China and other countries. And they have run a very sophisticated econometric test and come to the broad conclusion that if the head of the government of a foreign country meets the Dalai Lama, it leads to an 16% reduction in trade between that country and China. And if the head of a state meets the Dalai Lama, it leads to an 8% reduction in trade. So there seems to be some basis for making the argument that economically Western states suffer on account of meeting the Dalai Lama or for supporting the Tibet cause. But I would still go back, when it comes to advising him, I would go back to my argument about the Chinese expectation of appeasement, repeated appeasement. So I would say if the George Osborne and the British government gives in to the Chinese government on meeting the Dalai Lama on this instance, what would be the next Chinese expectation? What will be expected of the British government in the next and next and next encounters? So I would insist on the British government or any other European government to insist upon reciprocity. Because at the moment, there is no reciprocity, expectation of reciprocity. There is an unconditional engagement with the Chinese government, and which leads to questions about China's continued authoritarianism in both Chinese and Tibetan and other minority areas, which raises questions about future sustainability of the Chinese economy and the Chinese political system and the security of British and European investment in China. Because if the current political system moves on in a sort of very contradictory fashion between economic reforms and strengthening and political control, it will lead to an explosive situation in the future, which will have very strong implications for European and British economic and trading relationships with the Chinese. And I would insist on, going back to Dibyesh's point about the divided European response, I would insist upon George Osborne and other French leaders to be more cooperative in their dealing with Beijing and to tone down the level of division and the tendency to prey upon each other's misfortune and also to try to work with the Americans. Because if the Europeans are united, they are in competition with the US when it comes to dealing with the whole Western world is divided when it comes to dealing with the Chinese. So I would insist on a common sort of approach, European approach to dealing with China.
Okay. Shao, Jiang, do you want to add anything?
Oh, yeah. Because
Leave it here. Yeah.
I just maybe try to add some your question about the Cameroon. Because if you talk about the general thing, they just ignore. I just maybe ask the question. First question is about UN Human Rights Council election. Is 176 state members support China go back to Human Rights Council member, and only 16 state members oppose. Do you think I just ask, what is the British government position? Do you think if you don't use the UN human rights mechanism, what you can use by the leverage to change the human rights? You talk about a lot about the human rights and the democracy value, but what does it mean? It's only the business. So for me, it's nothing. This question for Cameron. The second question do you think about the Chinese Communist Party can maintain the power for how long? This economic crisis and the inside problem, environmental problem, do you think the British they can save for this situation from China's crisis? What is British people survive? That's a quite big question. So if you think about it, only you take the economic interest in British the business group want to keep the very close and make the great deal with the Chinese corrupt officials. A lot of the Chinese officials just come the British, buy the house. The British young generation cannot pay their own life. That's a big problem. What do you think this situation in British?
Okay. Thank you. And in fact, the way I would answer my own question is, let's see, first I would not like to meet him or meet them because they're all Tories and I don't like Tories per se. But second is, I could meet them on this particular issue. Simple question is, I know I'm being hypothetical because I don't really trust that they have any interest in their mind except their own interest. So they are not even interested in the British interest or British economy, but holding on to power here by playing games of economic growth and trying to destroy public sector in UK itself. So it's unlikely that I can convince them of anything except to remind them again and again of what others have said and what I was saying during my speeches, that look, if countries are relatively united, we are not talking for everyone united on China or on Tibet, but generally if they have the coordinated response, if China punishes one state, they did punish in Norway, for instance, because of Liu Xiaobo. If everyone refuses to meet with Chinese ambassador for 1 month or something symbolic, that would give a very strong message. That's something they can do. But to be honest, I don't really expect specifically Cameron or Osborne to do much about it because, as Jonathan rightly pointed out, they can be quite clownish when they go to China because they think that they are in a very different kind of world. But I want to add something, because I had thought of that, I could not cover in my lecture, which goes back to what Tsering pointed out. What is our role, and what even Martin pointed out, the state versus people kind of thing, right? What is our role as universities or as academics? Most of you who came here, you'll see, okay, there are at least 1, 2, 3, 4 academics here, right? But if you want to organize something similar and try to get academics in the UK who work on these kind of issues, you may only get 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, not many more. Let me give an example. For instance, for various reasons, I can use this Martin's example. Now, I'm just making it up, or my own example, it's easier. If, for various reasons, the Chinese government punishes me for something, for hosting the Dalai Lama, and we did have Dalai Lama right in this room and the next room both. First session was there and he came here. Now, thankfully, university did not have, and the university was very supportive, so I'm glad about that in terms of university support because it was about academic freedom. But the way in which, for instance, I got pressure from the Chinese after that. Now, if I say to my fellow academics saying, look, I'm not allowed into China because I hosted the Dalai Lama. How many British academics, or for that matter, Western academics will say, okay, we should all sign a petition in common that we will not go to China for research or we will not host Chinese scholars who come to Britain or to the West until unless there's reciprocity. To be honest, I don't think there will be a lot. So we in the West often would talk of we should not be racist towards anyone, which is very good. We should not be discriminatory against anyone, including Chinese, which is very fine. We should not be. But we're very bad when it comes to making a very ethical point that there has to be a level of reciprocity. If the Chinese can prevent Western academics of certain kinds from going into China on talking of certain issues, then there should be reciprocity where we also say, well, how do you expect us to host you then? So that reciprocity again also we hardly find here because academia also, like British system, is going into various directions where we talk of radical politics in theory, but when it comes to actual radical politics, we are anti-union, not we, many of us, anti-union, anti-radical, anti-everything except looking after own career. So it's broader problem in terms of political culture here, which we have to struggle against. Any question from audience? Now, who will take the mic? We'll have 3 questions. First, from this side, it would be easier. You have to switch it on. Emmanuel, give it. You know how to switch it on?
No.
Okay. Now, we'll have 3 to 4 questions. You can say it's directed to everyone or who is it directed to. Please keep it brief. We'll make notes and answer it together. That's the idea.
I want to ask the panel. I really like Martin's analysis, and I'm a little bit uneasy with your conclusion driving the situation from a Chinese point of view. But really the question, as I think, is has the West lost the morality in dealing with communist China? I ask this question specifically to Dibyesh because you said in your analysis that China will not punish US because it's a powerful country. To some extent, yes. But I think America has some core values that they have kept, which the West do not keep. And these are more important than asking Cameron and Osborne to what China, what they should do to UK in terms of trade. Because West should stand firm on the morality, not chased by Chinese money. Because West knows, as you have a saying, the one who pays the piper calls the tune. That is what the China is doing to the West now.
Okay, thank you. The second person, who else was there, right? Well, take him, it's easier, so just do it together.
Hi, Gareth Wall from the University of Birmingham. I have just 2 very quick questions. I was interested to see if the panel thought that the way the West deals with human rights issues in Tibet is any different to how they deal with human rights anywhere else. So
Okay.
it was highlighted recently with the Commonwealth posting in Sri Lanka, human rights issues there. I'm not sure whether it's a big difference, but maybe you guys think there is because of China. The other one was, it was mentioned by Tibet particularly, but the role of India is that there's a, I don't know, it's a myth, the rise of Asia in total, and India is obviously the other major regional player.
Thank you. And one more, okay, take him here, then one at the end also.
What
So
was the
4.
question? Could you
Oh.
just ask that question?
He said the way in which West deals with China over Tibet, is it something different from the way in which West deals with human rights issues of similar kind, say in Sri Lanka or any other part of the world?
My name is Dala. My question is mainly about forthcoming visits of David Cameron to China. David Cameron was very vocal about Tamil's treatment in Sri Lanka recently during his Commonwealth visit to Sri Lanka, and he met Mahinda Paksa, president of Sri Lanka, and confronted. Will he confront Chinese, and will he visit Jiang County, where the murder has happened? That's one question. Second one is mainly about the panel. I'm a Tibetan. We have been shouting China out of Tibet for 50 years. China is not an invited guest in Tibet, whereas in Britain, China is now an invited guest. How long do you think British will say free China out of Britain? That's the question.
Thank you. Last, well, one question from there, we'll come back, don't worry. Yeah. So, yes.
The question that to ask is one of the measures available to the West and perhaps the extension of the rest of the world regarding the Tibetan issue. What measures or questions are available to the West and extension of the rest of the world? And if you say that economic sanctions, I mean, I'm thinking hypothetically that you're saying economic sanctions are is one of the potential measure that we could exert on China. Are there no potential moral issues that can come from that? Given that we know that people who, the middle class and the lower classes, are usually the ones that feel economic sanctions most when we use other nations. China has lifted 300 million people out of poverty in the last 2 decades. Would that not raise potential moral issues?
Okay, so the question is that what measures are available to the West in order to deal with China over human rights abuses, and in case things like economic sanction, everything may make things worse rather than better. Yes. Now, who wants to start? Jonathan, you want to start? Any of these questions you want to address?
Look, all we have is our words, people in this room. We're dealing with cowards in our own countries, so that, for instance, when the Dalai Lama saw President Obama last time, he was ushered out the back door of the White House past the rubbish bins. When Cameron and Clegg saw the Dalai Lama, they saw him secretly, no publicity, in the bottom of St. Paul's. In 1991, the first person to go to China after Tiananmen, who was a kind of head of state, was John Major, the then prime minister. He told the press, including me, that he was going to go in and bang the table about human rights with Li Peng and give him a list of 300 political prisoners. He said that he had done it. A week later, I was told by an important official who was in the room that he never raised the problem, that he did it only to get the press to say that he'd done a good job. We're dealing with cowards in Whitehall and monsters who are bullies in Peking. Now, all we have is our words. I'd like to urge every person in this room who has strong feelings about the things we're talking about, write a letter to your MP, copy to David Cameron, write to Boris Johnson, flood them with letters telling them what cowards they are and telling them how to behave. It's what you would do if there were a problem in your neighborhood about a gang of vandals or bullies. You'd do something about it, wouldn't you? Well, write to these people, because all you have are your words, but your words are a weapon that people in power are afraid of. In China, they put you in jail for your words. Here, they might occasionally listen. Give it a try. Don't give up. Keep writing. Keep using your words. They're a great weapon.
Thank you. Tsering, you want to add?
Yes. I think my answer will be a combined answer to a number of the questions. One is to do with the so-called Western morality and the distinction that Sonamla drew between America and the West and the Europeans. From my perspective, as Jonathan pointed out, there hasn't been that much of a difference between how America engaged with Tibet and the European countries. You could see episodes in American engagement with Tibet where it was can be seen as a cynical use of Tibet, misuse of Tibetans for American strategic interests or American intelligence requirements. But when Tibet really needed American help, it wasn't always available, especially in the formal sense of American diplomatic or military help. To achieve the goals that the Tibetans had in mind. Of course, as Dibyesh pointed out, there was the military CIA project, but it was in the pursuit of American strategic Cold War interests rather than Tibetan aspirations for independence. And then the issue of whether the West deals with Tibet differently from similar issues. Again, as I was pointing out, whether we are talking about American anti-colonialism or the post-Cold War promotion of democracy and human rights by the West, human rights and other normative agenda was always at the bottom. Whether it came to Tibet or to other countries, Russia or other countries, it always got sacrificed. These agendas were pushed, normative agenda was pushed when it was convenient, when the target country was weaker. So we have David Cameron criticizing the Sri Lankan regime in Sri Lanka, but you wouldn't expect the same thing happening in Beijing. Or the West would push these human rights and normative agenda when they were congruent with the strategic and economic interests. So with regard to the question about China out of Britain, I don't think it will happen, and it should happen. Britain has always been open to immigrants. It's a multicultural society, and the Chinese have been here long before the Tibetans got here, and I think Britain should be open to the Chinese, because making a distinction between the Chinese government and Chinese people, and with regard to what measures the Western governments have on the issue of Tibet, I think economic sanctions have been tried and have failed. After the Tiananmen Square massacre, Western countries, including Japan, imposed sanctions. But only a few years after that, they were falling over each other to re-establish economic and trading relations with China. And we are talking about a China that was much more weaker than it is now. So I think I would insist on at least reciprocity, as I was pointing out, in the relationship, political, economic, and commercial relationship between the West and China. Insist on reciprocity at least, rather than appeasing China all the time.
Okay, Martin, you want to respond to it in any way?
Okay. When the Berlin Wall fell down, Fukuyama told us that history had ended, that the great battle of ideologies was over, and all that we would get from now on was either more or less efficient management of populations. When Tiananmen Square was done with, the Chinese government told its populace that they could get as wealthy as they liked as long as they stayed out of politics. The truth of the matter is that the question that we often set up here, and here unfortunately I speak as an anthropologist versus people who are in politics and international relations departments, is that there is a distinction between governments and people. And in this sense, when we're talking about things like human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the individual, we are not talking about East versus West. We are always talking about the state versus its population. And that applies here as much as it applies in the People's Republic of China. The truth of the matter is, in Europe and in Britain and in America, we have become increasingly docile populations. We don't get out and protest. We don't own our politics anymore. Or we certainly own it much less than we used to. A colleague of mine who was teaching recently noted that they asked the question of what democracy was for. And their students sort of said, well, it's about elections and parties and things on those lines. And not one of the students mentioned the possibility of themselves becoming an MP, themselves starting a party, themselves changing it. It was always somebody else. It was always David Cameron, or it was going to be Nick Clegg, or it's going to be somebody else, Boris Johnson. Whatever we do, we seem to have sleepwalked ourselves into a point where when we talk about politics, we're talking about somebody else. And in a sense, this is the question that Dala brought up, the question about China being in Britain. It's not a question of populations, it's a question of a culture of politics. A culture of politics that says, as long as you've got money in your pocket, keep your trap shut, and everything will be all right. Now, one of the things we found out in 2008, not in Tibet, but in Europe and America, was that everything actually wasn't all right. But we are moving into that territory, and that is not something that sets Europe and America against China. It is something that affects, and to a certain extent, infects all of our lives at some level. Whether we're Tibetan or Chinese or Indian or British or American, it does not matter. Last year, at the beginning of last year, I was doing research on the self-immolations, and I interviewed the deputy president of the Tibetan Youth Congress. And one of the questions that I put to him was the point made the previous day by Lobsang Sangye, the Tibetan prime minister, who had said, really, Tibetans shouldn't self-immolate in India because there were democratically available opportunities and options that weren't available in Tibet. And the deputy president looked at me very hard and he said, the politicians of this world, whoever they are, have no right to speak to any of us anymore about freedom. We live in the 21st century, and that is a century of violence and economics combined. And that is the puzzle that we are faced with. And it is a puzzle for all of us, not just about the Dalai Lama.
Shao, Jiang, you want to respond in any way?
Oh, yeah, I just maybe put some point for this is called democracy. It mainly means is just the territory state model is representative democracy. Is exclude the citizens' participation in the foreign affair and the international capitalism the deal, and also is exclude the citizens monitors is state power surveillance the freedom. That is a big question for if this keep this representative this democracy, they definitely limit in the to carry out is about the human rights international standard of democracy outside is only economic interesting dominant. That's problem is how to inside democracy countries people directly participate the political life, including the dealing with the foreign affairs and human rights of the other countries. The big question also is how can the citizens, democratic countries, help the other countries, people under the totalitarian and authoritarian the rule. That's a big question because we most talk about the state, the Cameroon and also is the leaders. We normally don't focus about the people and the citizens, especially civil society. How can help, for example, inside Tibetan civil society grew up? How can help the Chinese civil society understand the Tibetan issue. That I think the main issue to change.
Thank you. And then responding to all questions, but very briefly, because we should be brief in answering, we have more questions. Starting with the last question, what measures are available? Again, I'll start with his idea that it's not about punishing China for anything. Who's the West to punish China, given its own records in various ways? It's more about making sure that it does not go out of way to even not speak about Tibet. So the least they can do is encourage Tibetans to come and get more education. They can encourage Dalai Lama to come here and host him. They can encourage new generation of religious leadership in exile, including, let's say, Karmapa. They can encourage, they can do a lot of things that will be very much within the law without poking China and provoking China. They can do all of that without actually punishing China in various ways, but reminding China that, look, it's your problem, you deal with it, but don't expect us to make your internal problem our problem in terms of us somehow behaving in and policing ourselves. That's very important. In terms of forthcoming visit of David Cameron to China, will he confront? No. I mean, I'd be absolutely surprised if he confronts China in any way. He would not confront China the way he did not confront India 2 years ago when he went to India and in Kashmir around 120 young people were killed by Indian troops. Not a single police person, not a single military man had been killed by the protesters. It was largely a stone throwing protest, and yet David Cameron, like Barack Obama, could not open the mouth to utter the word K, Kashmir. So, I mean, that context, we should have no hope in terms of David Cameron raising anything, and he might at best say here that he's going to raise it there, but as with John Major, he'll end up not raising it because he only realized that he has to somehow assure his voters here that he has not given up on human rights. But to be honest, he has, like most of the leaders here have done that. Now, in terms of, is there difference in terms of how West deals with Tibet? Now, of course, many Uyghurs feel that why does everyone talk of Tibet, not us? Many people elsewhere, my Kashmiri friends, and one of the questions I had on Facebook was saying, why does no one talk of Kashmir but they talk of Tibet? He also raised a very valid question. Why does Dalai Lama, who goes to Kashmir, invited by Indian government, not only not say anything, but sometimes says things that is almost like anti-people but pro-state? So I have my own explanation of that. But coming back to here, I don't think there's much difference. In the past, for various reasons, and because of personality of the Dalai Lama, the West, and we are talking of not Western people here, Western states and Western government, found that somehow they had obligation to talk of Tibet and talk of Dalai Lama. But that obligation or that feeling is also going away now. And I hope events such as this, or through our own work, we can try to remind our own governments, and through your work of various kinds, we remind our own government that at the very least, give hope to Tibetans. For me, the liberation of Tibet will not come via West. It never will. It will not come via even Dalai Lama. It will come via Tibetan people themselves working along with Chinese people against authoritarian system. So at the very least, we could give them hope by saying, we are listening to you. We have not closed our ears to you. Final question in terms of, has West lost morality in dealing with communist China and America has more values? I mean, I don't agree with it. West has no morality. Neither has US any morality. If it had morality, we would not be in the situation we are in today. China reflects exactly, in a sense, China shows a more truthful mirror to what Western states do behind back of everyone. And sometimes not even behind the back, when you look at what happens in Iraq or elsewhere. It has not lost morality, but morality lies, or political morality lies with the citizens. It is the citizens who can mobilize and write to the MPs, because MPs will listen, write to David Cameron, hopefully he will listen, right? Maybe we can have enough pressure put on them to pay some lip service. Because in the end, the solution is lies with Tibet and within China. Next round of questions from here. And in the meantime, while you bring your mic, there's a question from Sue Roberts, Australia. I don't know which part of Australia. She was asking that, what about UN Declaration of Human Rights? Katya, you had raised that? Yeah, UN Declaration of Human Rights. Are there international law and regimes that can be used to put pressure on China? I mean, are there any international law that the Tibetans or the Western states have obligation to, such as Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that can be used to help China? Second was from Mary Blancas, who's from Mexico, but also here in the audience. And Sarah Helena, she is a student of ours, and she had asked, and I'm asking the question because they put it to me in the past, what is the role of Western support groups? Do Tibet support groups really help? Does the boycott intercontinental hotel kind of campaigns help in any way, or do they backfire? So one question is regarding international law. Is there any way in which that can be used by Tibetans? Second is about Western support groups and the campaign and tactics they have, including boycott. These are two questions you have to remember. And third was from Khati again.
I almost forgot the question.
Oh, sorry. I speak a lot. What? Yeah.
Okay, wow, there's so many things to say. I have to focus everything, put it in one. I suppose my question sort of touches upon academia and academia's role in terms of countering the Chinese narrative of, what they're trying to put forward as a unified China and so forth. Okay, I do want to make a comment about the United States. So whenever anybody thinks about the United States, think about the Native American situation in the United States and how that in many ways resembles the Tibetan situation inside China, and then think twice about America and American special principles about humanity. Okay, but my question is about the Confucian Institute. What we see lately a lot is that whenever there is any kind of demand for the teaching of and dissemination of Chinese cultural information and aspects of Chinese language, it always somehow ends up going via the Confucian Institute. And the Confucian Institute, in fact, is copied into all emails, and I know I speak from first-hand experience, to do with even little things like, to give a Chinese taster, really, to the British secondary school students. And I have been to one of those. In fact, I've co-organized one event with the Chinese New Year last year, and the person who saw us, who's in charge of the Chinese language and culture program, her first thing was to put on screen a very red map of China, including Tibet, Xinjiang, Tibet, and start talking about Chinese unity, Chinese the Chinese story of how China is amazing and great. And her actually was more political talk than the cultural talk. So my question would be to you, to the academics, yes. What can we do to counter this sort of, the Chinese are working through academia trying to establish a certain kind of narrative about themselves.
And how to challenge that. Any other question from this side? The gentleman there.
morality and about Chinese human rights violations and everything. But what about the history of Tibet and before China did take control of Tibet? From my understanding, it wasn't a very nice place for everyone who wasn't, the ruling class. And when China came in, the people who were slaves got land, they got education, and basically, if you're not, the ruling class or the Buddhist monks, now they have land and education, which they didn't have before, and they got rid of the brutal practices of chopping hands off for crime. So, where is that in all of this talk of morality and the state being, bad?
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? One last one, because there's the guy, the back.
Hi, my name is Peter. I'm from Northern Ireland originally. My question is, a lot of the countries that are getting support have kicked up a fuss by using arms and stuff. The Tibetan process is a lot more peaceful. They listen to the Dalai Lama. And so and this is just a question, so it's just trying to get your own opinions. Do you think that they would kick up more of a fuss that more action would be done from the Western countries, or do you think that this is the right way to go?
Okay, thanks. Fine. This is the last round because I promised to finish very soon. By 8:15. I know time flies, isn't it? We have hardly covered. There are many more questions on my Facebook. Anyway, so who will start? Would like to start? Martin? Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Let's get concrete here, I guess. Confucius Institute. For those of you who don't know, the Confucius Institute is, they are slightly like the British Council. They work as a wing of Hanban, which is the Ministry of Education in China, and they are set up in a variety of universities across the world, and they've been expanding quite substantially. Generally speaking, they teach Chinese language, they present the Chinese state's view of China and Chinese history and all of these things. Okay, I'm going to have to own up to an interest here. I am the chairman, despite what you may have thought, I am the chairman of a China Studies group, which is funded by the Confucius Institute. That surprised you. The Confucius Institutes are an interesting beast, but it comes back to Jonathan's point. A friend of mine, when one first came to the University of Aberdeen, I had some profound misgivings. There are a lot of problems with Confucius Institutes. For example, they won't employ anyone who is a member of a Tibet sport group, or is a member of Falun Gong, or any of a very long list of people that are, basically speaking, illegal as far as the Chinese government is concerned, despite the fact that that is in complete contradiction of British employment law. They also give scholarships only to people who are, quote, healthy in body and mind, despite the fact that that is opposed to certain other laws in this country. So there are issues. However, let's talk strategy here. Confucius Institutes, the history shows they tend to only last about 5 years in most universities. Having worked with one, the Edinburgh one, for quite a long time, what's the phrase a colleague of mine used, and he was from another university which had a Confucius Institute. They're an entirely tameable dragon. They're an entirely tameable dragon. The problem with many Confucius Institutes is that they generate quite indirectly exactly the culture that Tsering was talking about earlier, which is a tendency for university administrations to throw themselves into the activity of submission, which is basically being sit there and say, we have a Confucius Institute and we mustn't offend them, so we shall not allow the Dalai Lama to come onto campus, Sydney University. Okay? Despite the fact that the Confucius Institute nor the Chinese government ever said anything about it. Okay? In other words, in many cases, with reference to the Confucius Institute, the problem is actually not the Confucius Institutes, but our rather odd response to them. We must remember something very important. Members of the Chinese government are fully entitled to come here and say what they think about Chinese history. That's called freedom of speech. We shouldn't stop that. They're entitled to say what they have to say about the matter. And so are other people to disagree with them. It's called freedom of speech. And you must cling on to it even if you disagree. Okay? I disagree with what they think about Chinese history. But I'll fight for the right to be able to say it. Okay? We need to be careful about jumping too far the other way. Freedoms are freedoms, whether we approve of them or not. So, with reference to the Confucius Institute, I would say this, once again, they are an entirely tameable dragon, and it is important that they're tamed. I'll leave that one at that.
Okay. Shao, Jiang, you want to respond to anything? Because the last word, because we'll have no question after this.
Yeah, okay, just short is about the Confucius Institute. I think they quite the...
Will they ever employ you?
No.
Okay.
No.
He has been, well, you can tell something about yourself.
So because they talk about the Falun Gong and the Chinese descent, they have a long list for that. It's quite deep politics. They just show some culture in this version. This is the official version, and maybe you can look the long history in China. The dead arts, the dead language, they don't want to touch the sensitive issue, Tibetan issue and other issue. That's a big problem. Also, you talk about if you give the official freedom of expression, why the Chinese inside and the Tibetan inside, they have no rights. They practice freedom of expression. That's a big question. They use this freedom of expression, this country, but they they definitely stop the practice of freedom of expression in China. That they take the double standard. They just use that one. That is the big question. So this response confused institution. For about the international human rights law, I think is quite big important for Chinese, because if you go back to look the Chinese education, normally the party control the education, so the people they have not rights consciousness. If the youth they look about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Human Rights Conventions, they know what it means human rights, what they have. They have some rights. That's very important. If you only look the Chinese law, it's a contribution between the rights and the monopoly power of Chinese Communist Party. It's because the Chinese PRC constitution, they put it together, mixture the citizens' rights and the Communist Party leadership. It means the Communist Party hold the monopoly power in China. What does it mean? You cannot use citizens' rights, challenge the Communist Party. That's a big problem. So go back to 2003, maybe you know the China, the right practice and the activities they use is the defender rights movement. It means use defender rights according based on the Chinese law. But the Chinese law, a lot of the problem, if you contrast to the international human rights standard, that is a big problem. After the Arab Spring, they gave very big, inspired the Chinese citizens. Okay, they think about, we not only use this Chinese law, because Chinese law, a lot of the problem, they began to reference the international human rights standard. And they now understand that a lot of the UN human rights mechanism, they think about this leverage can interact with outside the citizens' movement. So that's very, very, very helpful. I think in 2009, the Tibetan group, they and also organized events in Geneva. Is invited the Chinese writer and distant democracy activities and the Tibetan exile. They talk about this issue. During that time, I remember I pushed we must respect this Tibetan self-determination, but the most Chinese just oppose this idea. They think only give the autonomy, because they think about it. The idea they base it from the unity. China is big thing, is a good thing. If you talk about the Tibetan self-determination, it's very, very bad. That is a big problem because it's an education problem. Now inside the Chinese, they just reflect all the education. They began, especially for human rights lawyer, human rights activities, they reference international human rights standard. I think a very big chance for between the Chinese and the Tibetan understand each other problems.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan?
Oh, yes, I'd like to say something about what you said, which is very important, about what was Tibet like before the Chinese got there. When I was coming up in Chinese studies in America in the middle and late 1950s, we all were told by our teachers in these Ivy League universities how great the Mao reforms had been in China between 1950 and 1957. Land reform, the end of landlordism, and so forth. Now, the Dalai Lama is the first to say that Tibet before 1950 was much the way you've described it. But what you seem not to know is that the Chinese did not actually return any land to Tibetans in the same way that they didn't with their own peasants in China. They did it for a few years, and then the land was dealt with in a year or two in another way. All kinds of things were done to the monasteries. It's very easy to believe the myth that is put out by the Chinese about land reform, education, popular rights, and so forth. It's basically a lie. If you'd like to read a good book about this, it's by Melvin Goldstein. So what you have learned about Tibet is what people like me learned about China in the 50s, that Mao was a great man and there was land reform and so forth and so forth. It's just not true. A final word of advice from me: don't go to bed tonight without writing a letter on some issue that's important to you about China, human rights in Tibet, to your MP or to Hague or somebody like that. Don't go to bed without writing at least one note. You're not powerless. You're dealing with people whose values are different from yours, but they are not immune to what you think. Use your weapon, which is your words.
Thank you. Very quickly, and then
I'll touch on 3 points. One, the human rights instruments within the UNHCR. There are many instruments within the UNHCR framework that Tibetans and others can use and have used. But these are more to do with hurting China's image rather than getting any practical sort of outcomes. And the problem with international law in general and the UN framework is that it is there for powerful states to take advantage of when it suited their interests, or violate them when it didn't suit their interests. And less powerful states and non-state entities like the Tibetans do not have a lot of space to use these instruments to their advantage. Secondly, regarding the academic community's role in terms of countering Chinese narrative, especially to do with the Confucius Institutes, I think the best contribution academics can make is by doing research on various issues of Tibet to do with Chinese-Tibetan relations, and to publish them. And not so much in terms of countering Chinese narratives, but publishing the findings as you find them. So you might have inconvenient facts to report about the Tibetans, Tibetan leaders, Tibetan officials, Tibetan history, as much as about the Chinese. So I think it's important to put the facts out there as you find them. I think that's the best contribution. In terms of the Confucius Institutes, I think one thing that we have, people are starting to realize is that we know about the funding and all of that, but the decision-making mechanism seems to be a replication or an extension of the Chinese political, social, economic system in China. In Chinese political system, there is something called a PNZ, which is a list of top officers that are appointed by the Communist Party's Human Resources Department. And in China, university chancellors, media heads, all of them are appointed by the Communist Party. And you would find Communist Party officials even within business companies in China. Now, in the Confucius Institutes, if I'm not wrong, there seems to be a process of a dual leadership, one from the host university and one from the Chinese side. And the Chinese official in the Confucius Institute is always appointed by the Hanban, or the Chinese government. And so it seems to be an extension of the decision-making process within China itself. And it is taking place in the context of a Western academia, which seems to add a new dimension to the Confucius Institute problem.
with last one, because no one has addressed.
Yeah, I think I would add to this the last two questions about Tibet's history and also the perception of Tibetan peacefulness. The problem with the Western engagement with Tibet is either seeing Tibetans as, through the Shangri-La myth, as compassionate, peaceful people who do not have worldly problems. So denying the real problems that Tibetans are facing in contemporary Tibet, or through the Chinese propaganda of seeing Tibet as a feudal hell, Tibet's past. Tibetans have always been and are a people of this world with both positive and negative attributes. Historically, Tibetans had a lot of problems, and the Tibetans who know about Tibet's history are the first ones to point out those mistakes. Those were the mistakes that led us to the current problem. So it was a feudal society where wealth and power was in the hands of a handful of aristocratic and monastic estates. There's no doubt about that. And Tibet traditionally had its own systems of meting out punishment to criminals, as you pointed out. But which society did not have social problems in history? Which society did not have ways to punish criminals? In fact, the Chinese had far more draconian ways of punishing criminals. There was the system of death by 1,000 cuts. You would be tied to a stake, and a sharp knife, a person with a sharp knife will cut a piece of your body one by one until you pass away. These sort of punishment systems were brought to Tibet by the Manchu imperialists, right? So, but is that a justification for the Chinese occupation of Tibet and the rule that they are exercising in Tibet? The Japanese made the same arguments about occupying China in the 20th century as they did in the rest of Asia. European colonialists and imperialists made the same arguments of development and modernization to justify their colonialism in the rest of the world. So to some extent, there seems to be a double standard, again, when it comes to China.
Okay. Very briefly, I'll answer because we have to wind this up. Again, going back to the question of Western support groups, boycott and everything, remember, the key challenge the Western support groups on Tibet face is that why are they supporting the Tibetans? Are they supporting because they think Tibetans are somehow uniquely victimized? Are they supporting because they think Tibetans are inherently peaceful and sort of suffering from Chinese? Or are they supporting because they support human rights, they support right of self-determination, and they somehow feel that this cause symbolizes the wider struggle that takes place in the rest of the world? So Western support groups have to also evolve and see Tibetans themselves as having political agency rather than sort of innocent kittens that they have to save. That's very important for that. In terms of academia role and countering, I don't think it's our role is to simply give say what we see. It's very important, but I think there's an ethical duty that we as academics have to counter the dominant myth. It's not enough to give alternative myth, but counter the dominant myth actively. So for instance, if China says, historically Tibet was so bad and everything, and now look, they are a land of milk and honey and everyone is singing, dancing happily, and sometimes they burn themselves up because they're so happy. Right? That's the kind of version the Chinese government gives. Our role is to challenge it, question it, counter it. But that will go on and on about, because you have to look at China in terms of multiple histories of China, multiple pluralities of China. China is an immensely diverse place in terms of discourses that operate there. So we have to highlight those, at least that's how I see. We have to highlight the suppressed histories of China and of Tibet rather than simply giving all of them together and let people decide. I think it's our role to remind what the dominant notion of history does to the people, because that's the only way in which you can challenge colonization. In terms of Tibetan protests, more peaceful, violent kind of thing, well, if it gets more violent, let's say Xinjiang, what would happen? Not much. So I don't think that's going to highlight Tibetan issue a lot. Yet, remember, most people in China, most people in Tibet who are protesting today are not protesting because they have seen the Dalai Lama and they want to see the Dalai Lama, no doubt. But they are products of Chinese colonial system, including Chinese education. They are not being influenced by outsiders that look, just go and burn your body. They are product of colonial system, and we have to remember, all nationalist movements in the non-Western world were anti-colonial, and they are products of colonialism. And that's what's happening in Tibet, that they are largely anti-colonial. The biggest and most stark challenge, of course, which Tibetans face is the different forms of Chinese colonization. But one way is it also colonize reincarnation. We are dealing with a government that is communist, that does not believe in God, that allows freedom of worship to some people to some extent, yes, but does not believe in God. And yet the same government, the same party claims the right to shape what the soul of the Dalai Lama will do once it passes on from 14th to 15th. Now, what miracle and what power Chinese government has, we don't know. But that's very much part of colonization of even the sacred. And as to conclude in that sense, I would say that let us see it, and that's how I see it, let us see it as an anti-colonial project that's meant to liberate everyone, including Tibetans, but not exclusively Tibetans. On that note, I'll end this session, but let me thank people who have been doing all this hard work. I'll know some names, Sokbay, Jalal, Emmanuel there, Greg Past, and I don't know your names, but thank you very much. And thanks a lot to all the speakers for taking time out, and thanks a lot to you. Thank you.